Hello, everyone. We are going to get started tonight. We have a few seats, especially back here in the corner, so if you're just coming in, you can go check that out. Well, good evening and welcome to our second program in this partnership for this year. We've been so excited to work with the World Affairs Council and all of this and the Civil Discourse series that we're doing with them, and we have another one next week, so make sure you check that out as well. I am Kip O'Dell, Programming Manager at Kent District Library, and we're happy to present this program presented by both Kent District Library and the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan. We also want to express our gratitude to the Paul Henry Center for Christianity and Politics at Calvin College and to Warner Norcross and Judd for assisting as series sponsors. At Kent District Library, our motto is information, ideas, and excitement, and we challenge the traditional concepts of a library. We have a lot of great programs at the library that are for all ages, all across the county for all of our 19 branches. A couple of examples of that are this Saturday here at the Wyoming Library. They are having their very large book sale in this very room, which is always very popular. Also at the Cascade branch on Sunday, April 29th, we have a Scottish folk singer. His name is Jim Malcolm. He is really fantastic. So we do concerts and we do just all sorts of programs for people, and that's another great example of programming that Kent District Library does. Another thing, if you didn't see them on the table, when you leave, we have bookmarks that have some books from each of our 3 speakers for this series. The library system has all of those books in them, so you can put them on hold, and it gives you some extra reading if you want to read more about these topics that we're talking about. After Mr. Lessenberry's presentation this evening, there will be ample time for questions. We're going to have the microphone being carried around for you so that you can ask questions. You also got a question card as well that you can fill out, and we'll be asking some of those questions to Mr. Lessenberry as well. Dr. Erica Kubik, Director of Programming for the Council, will moderate the Q&A session for us. And now I want to introduce Michael Van Dennett, the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan, who will introduce our speaker tonight.
Thanks, Kip. And we're deeply grateful to KDL for funding and for this collaboration on our Civil Discourse series. The mission of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan is to empower the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world.
That sounds better. Thanks, Kip. The mission of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan is to empower the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world. So a perfect combination of the Kent District Library's mission and our mission to put this series on, Civil Discourse. And Civil Discourse is
one. It's okay, Kip. I'll project. Civil Discourse is one of the 5 mission and vision statements of the World Affairs Council. Mr. Lessenberry probably doesn't need an introduction to all you folks. You tapped in to hear him, and you've been delighted to hear his commentary, his voice on the radio, but I'll give it a crack anyway. He's a Detroit native. He originally intended to be a historian, but he recognized that he wanted to go into journalism in his graduate studies at the University of Michigan. Since then, he has accumulated nearly 40 years of journalism experience in every medium, from newspapers to the internet. Jack has worked as a foreign correspondent and as executive national editor of the Detroit News. He has written for many national and regional publications, including Vanity Fair, Esquire, the New York Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe. In addition to his work at Michigan Radio, he is head of journalism at Wayne State University. He's a contributing editor and columnist for the Metro Times, Dome Magazine, the Traverse City Record Eagle, the Detroit Blade, where he also serves as an ombudsman and hosts the weekly public affairs program Deadline Now for WGTE TV in Toledo. Jack told me that he learned that to be organize your time well was to be a successful journalist, and all these things going on, oh my goodness, he must organize his time well. Among his favorite memories are interviewing Gerald Ford about Watergate in 1995, and winning a national Emmy for a documentary about Jack Kevorkian in 1994. On a personal note, Jack says he mostly stopped watching television, except for documentaries, when Mr. Ed was canceled. He does admit, however, to a fondness for the crusty old butler from Downton Abbey. His presentation this evening is entitled The Loss of American Consensus. Are we better off with the Cold War and without the internet? Please welcome Jack Lessenberry.
Well, after that introduction, I feel like I should just say, in conclusion, my electronics are attacking me. Just hang on a second. They actually, the truth is that he tells me what Michael tells me what to say with these wires. I'm just pretty pissed. It's seriously, it's an honor to have been invited here today, and an honor that all you people would give up a Tuesday night for me. I especially want to thank Erica Kubik. Where are you, Erica? You're the director of programming, for working with me and taking care of all the logistical arrangements. I've had to do that often for guest speakers. I just brought Morris Dees, the founder of the Southern Poverty Law Center, into Wayne State last week to speak, and I know what a pain dealing with us can sometimes be. So Eric, I hope I didn't cause you too much grief. I also want to commend each and every one of you for taking an interest in world affairs and for establishing and keeping this chapter going. More than I can say of us in Detroit. Nearly 30 years ago, I helped revitalize the World Affairs Council chapter in Memphis, Tennessee, where I was living at the time. I was an assistant managing editor of a newspaper. We held an enormous black tie fundraiser to kick things off, and I got the state's relatively unknown junior senator, a young fellow named Al Gore, to be the keynote speaker. The date, I always have a great sense for timing. The date I set for this 6 months in advance was July 16th, 1991, which happened to be the night the first Gulf War started. Senator Gore earned my eternal gratitude because he didn't listen to his staff's advice to cancel and head back to Washington. He gave the speech first. After that, I voted for him every chance I got. Unfortunately, I didn't live in Florida. So some of us are old enough to remember what that means. So my provocative title tonight is, were we better off with the Cold War and without the internet? For those of you of Erica's age, there was a time when we didn't have the internet. Well, I imagine that some of you, and maybe some people who saw this title and decided not to come, saw that and said, what kind of an idiot question is that? Does he really miss the fear of nuclear war? Does he really think we'd be better off without being able to look up factoids in a nanosecond on our smartphones? Well, to answer the second question first, do I really think we'd be better off without our smartphones, without having a way to reach the World Wide Web always on our person? Well, yes, make the heretic. Sometimes I do. Sometimes we want to get away from it all. The difference between us and the people in George Orwell's 1984 is they wanted to get away from the telescreens that watch them all the time. We go into a panic if we leave ours 5 feet away from us. But there is sometimes more to truth and knowledge than factoids on Google. 3 years ago, I paid a former student to drive my wife and I to the airport one summer. We were going to Maine for a week. And the student came in and had breakfast first, and later she said, you guys have got an awful lot of books. Couldn't you get most of them on Kindles? And I said, well, I like having books. And she said something. She said, well, they get dusty and they're heavy. She said, you know, I guess when you were young, you probably had to look stuff up in books. And I said, I still do. And she gave me the sort of look you'd expect if I told her I was converting all my digital files to tape cassette. Now, I'm not a Luddite, totally. I do use my little smartphones to look up things all the time, even though I know it's helped kill newspapers through my first log. But I know, as we all do, that this is also essentially the same device a congressman named Anthony Weiner used to send dirty pictures of himself to underage girls. I haven't learned how to do that. And that, by the way, as we're finding out this week with James Comey's memoir, that may well sway the last presidential election by triggering an FBI investigation, et cetera, et cetera. There are elements about the internet that remind me sometimes of Sauron's Ring of Power, if you've read The Lord of the Rings, but I'm not sure I have the strength to throw it into the fire either. And my mind's been enslaved by it too. But the internet, even those of us who can remember when we didn't have it, the internet has changed our culture dramatically in many ways. In my youth, before the smartphone and the World Wide Web, when people went out to dinner on a date, life was radically different. They often had to talk to each other. And as you see that in restaurants, some people are sitting here, I don't know whether they communicate with each other or not, but they're not talking to each other. And as for the fear of nuclear war, yes, we had a couple of close calls early in the Cold War, most notably the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I remember very well. As a fat little kid, not quite 11, being made to practice wedging myself under the desk so I could survive when the H-bomb blew out the school windows. Anyone else ever remember that? Have to do that? Good. Now, my family was too poor to afford a bomb shelter, although the teacher kept telling us to get one, and so we were encouraged to learn which corner of the basement would be best to hide in. Now, I knew I'd have no chance of survival. I couldn't even fit my whole body under the desk. And even then, I was a precocious little kid without friends, and I had read enough about Rengens and radiation and life on Look magazine to realize that the best thing that I could do if the worst happened would be to stand in the middle of the playground and wait to be vaporized, rather than emerge from a hole and die of radiation sickness. I actually do think that would be the best way to go if we actually ever do have a real nuclear war. Yet, at least after that October of 1962, maybe even before, I think, I'm convinced, there was actually considerably less chance of a nuclear bomb being dropped on people than there is now. Terrorism, in the way we think of it today, barely existed in the years of the classic Cold War, and it was inconceivable in the 1960s that a freelancer could get his or her hands on a nuclear weapon. But let's go back to my main proposition. We're better off with the Cold War without the internet. Well, in one very important way that relates to the whole theme of these lectures, we were. We knew in the world of the Cold War who we were as a people and what we stood for. There was an American consensus, not a complete consensus, not one on race, certainly, not on religion, perhaps, though in my long ago childhood, we thought we were fast moving past religion as a grounds for strife. Half a century ago, in my junior high school, the teacher rolled his eyes at the fact that just less than 40 years before, that these ignorant rubes in Tennessee had actually thought evolution there wasn't any evolution. They didn't believe in evolution. How could that be? We thought we were past all of that. Well, how naive we were. There was not uniform consensus on many aspects of domestic politics and economics, of course, but there was a vast consensus that we, this country, were not part of the Soviet Union's block of communist dictatorships. We thought of ourselves as a free world, and there was a vast consensus that this was a bipolar world. We knew we were us, not them. This was seen in darkly Manichaean terms by some, in less apocalyptic terms by others, increasingly less as the years wore on. And eventually, we came to see, by the 1970s, some elements of the bipolar confrontation, sort of the way Boston Red Sox fans think of the New York Yankees. They were bad guys, but they weren't necessarily evil. Or maybe the way Detroit football fans might feel if the Detroit Lions were a major league team. But what was fundamental to our understanding of ourselves in these years of American consensus, I'm talking about roughly the years 1945 to 1991 or 2 was that we were not the other guys and we weren't the bad guys. You know, I think throughout our history, I think we tend to think in terms of dichotomies. We've often, always tended to see the world through an us versus them filter. Patriots versus redcoats. Cowboys versus Indians. Grand Rapids versus Detroit. Then came World War II. 73 years ago this month, on April 25th, 1945, Soviet and American armies came together in a place called Torgau, cutting what remained of Nazi Germany in half. They popped champagne, pledged eternal friendship. 2 weeks later, World War II was over in Europe. 3 months later, it came to an unexpectedly early end in the Pacific. But even before that war was over, it was clear that there would be only two significant powers left on Earth when it ended: the United States and its allies or satellites, and the Soviet Union and its satellites or allies. We were, this country, immensely rich and essentially undamaged by the war, certainly undamaged in a civilian sense. The Soviet Union had a far larger standing army, but we felt that we were safe essentially because we had the bomb. Well, that lasted for all 4 years until they exploded in 1/2. That, at the time, caused mass intellectual panic. How could these primitive, backwards Russians make an atom bomb? Because we've always assumed that other nations were primitive and backwards. And, of course, we thought they must have stolen the secrets from us, something that had some elements of truth in it, not completely or even mostly true, but they did have, there were Soviet atom spies. But then 8 years later, when I was in kindergarten, the Russians launched a satellite in the outer space, Sputnik. I remember being taken in the backyard. My father was trying to find it, trying to look for it. And this was very unnerving. How could they do that? We immediately tried to do the same thing, and it blew up on the launching pad. I remember watching that in school. We were traumatized. We were scared out of our minds. These evil commies were ahead of us. This had the, but of course, I was very fascinated by that, but I was turned against communism for life when I found out they set up another satellite with a dog in it. I said, well, how are they going to get the dog back? And they said, well, they're not. It's going to die up there. That was it. That was communism. So the dog's name was Laika. I still remember that. It turned out, by the way, the dog got killed when they launched the thing because they didn't adequately pad it, but they still killed the dog. Anybody who kills a dog, that's a political system I don't want to be part of. But enough of my personal politics. But the Soviets getting ahead of us temporarily in space made us even closer united as a nation, and had the highly beneficial effect of a stunned Congress making all sorts of money available so that relatively poor kids like me could afford a college education. We thought we had a vested interest in an educated public. Not only just engineers, anybody could get money to go to school. And education was subsidized. You didn't know this already. In the late 60s, early 70s, the government paid Michigan with federal pass-through funds, paid about 75% of our tuition. Now, students pay 75%. Well, before long, America was launching satellites of its own. The space race was on. This was a big factor in promoting unity in this nation. And we eventually, of course, won the space race. About that time, there was a story, it's been told in Washington. It was probably apocryphal, maybe not, but it went something like this. Some young firebrand, hothead, gets elected to Congress from a town like Grand Rapids. Any resemblance to Justin Amash is purely coincidental. And some young firebrand gets elected to Congress. He gives his maiden speech and denounces the other party as the enemy. Now, afterwards, the kindly old Speaker of the House takes him aside and says, "Son, the other party is not the enemy. We are all Americans here. We don't use those words here. The other party is the opposition, not the enemy." Now, in the Washington, the political circles version of that story, the old congressman, the old Speaker of the House said, "Son, the enemy is the Senate." But in the world in which I grew up, everybody knew the enemy was the Soviet Union. There was even a saying, a saying that we've sort of sadly forgotten now that politics stopped at the water's edge. You could beat people up over domestic policy things, but the country had to have a united foreign policy. That wasn't always it turned out in practice not always to be a good thing. Look up in the index, war, Vietnam. But it was a unifying thing. And after all, Khrushchev had sworn to bury us and taken his shoe off and pounded it on the table at the UN. You know, some of us remember that. So what the Cold War did, especially the early part of the Cold War, was spur a whole lot of scary novels about the coming nuclear Armageddon. Alas, Babylon. Anyone ever read that? That was a big book when I was a kid. 7 Days in May. Failsafe was mandatory reading in my junior high school. In 7th grade, I had to read that. It's a book that describes how an accidental nuclear war was narrowly averted when President Kennedy has hydrogen bombs dropped on New York City because we accidentally bombed Moscow when Jackie and the kids were there. And, well, eventually, following this Cuban Missile Crisis, which scared even the policymakers out of their socks, we evolved to a point we didn't worry most of the time about a sudden sneak attack nuclear war. That did flare up from time to time. There was always a fear in both camps that one side would get what we call first strike capacity, by which they meant a technological breakthrough so stunning that one side might feel that it could launch a Pearl Harbor type sneak attack and completely disable the opposition, wiping them out and ensuring universal peace forevermore. But that never happened. The Cuban Missile Crisis did scare us into a desire for stability. We established the famous hotline. It was actually sort of a telex machine. It's always depicted as a red phone, but it's a telex machine. And to try to avoid accidental Armageddon. And this is my favorite. I covered arms control for a number of years, so I had to learn all this stuff. And this is my favorite. Both sides adopted the marvelously appropriate doctrine known as MAD, which stood for Mutually Assured Destruction, which was first announced, I think, by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, the architect of the Vietnam War. What MAD meant was that if either side fires one nuclear missile, drops one nuclear bomb, accidentally or on purpose, the other side fires all theirs and ends the world. That sounds nuts. It's what prevented us from having a nuclear war. There was one last classic flare-up of nuclear jitters in the early 1980s. I wrote a lot about this at the time. When President Ronald Reagan had this idea for a foolproof missile defense system in outer space, which was nicknamed Star Wars. He called it the Strategic Defense Initiative. And the idea was it would use space-age laser technology to protect our nation from any nuclear strike. He said after we developed it, we'd give it to the Soviet Union too, so everybody could be secure. The Soviet Union didn't believe that for a minute. And while this sounded great and wonderful, by the way, I once heard Caspar Weinberger give a speech about this to an audience in not this city, but a city like this one. And a woman raised her hand and said, would it interfere with the reception if I was watching my VCR? People have their priorities in order. And he said, no, it would bother the TV, but not your VCR. So she was happy. But this wasn't actually a reality, and this was stabilizing because, you know, nobody really believed this would work except Ronald Reagan and maybe Caspar Weinberger. There are a whole lot of defense contractors who pretended to so they could sell the government billions of dollars worth of stuff, but the Soviet Union was scared. They knew they were behind technologically, and some feared they might launch a first strike if they ever thought this thing might become operational. This, in turn, fueled a whole round of new scary movies and books. Like, I remember there's a TV movie called The Day After, and well, I think it features Jason Robards, and his kid's getting his eyes melted out or something like that. It's been a while. But, well, Star Wars, interestingly, that never happened, and Reagan left office, and George Bush I quietly sort of killed that program because nobody believed in it. But the technological threat that posed to the Soviet Union ended up, oddly enough, becoming the thing that caused the end of American consensus and the seeds of that other system's downfall. Now, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev came to power in March 1985 in a nation that was acutely aware it was falling dangerously behind in terms of technology. If you remember, the Soviets had a sequence of really old leaders who served about, there's Brezhnev, and then there's Andropov, and Chernenko. The latter two lasted only a year. They were dying when they got the job. They became the national laughingstock. So they took this young, vibrant guy, Gorbachev, and he thought the Soviet Union could be saved. He was the last sort of believer in a good system of socialism, communism. He thought he would give people glasnost, open this perestroika, restructuring. They would want to work with him to help make socialism work. And the only person who believed that was him. Without a command economy, without military pressure, without being forced to produce, they didn't produce. Things got worse and worse progressively. In August of 1991, there was a coup. The whole hardliners tried to put back the old system of the Soviet Union, but Gorbachev had liberalized things to the point that they had CNN. People could see what was going on, and they didn't obey the leadership's demands to, essentially give up freedom. The army would fire on their own people. The whole coup collapsed, and with that, communism collapsed. And then suddenly, in one of the most destabilizing moments psychologically this country's ever had, there we are, Christmas Day, 1991. Gorbachev comes out on the TV screens all over the world announcing that the Soviet Union was going out of business like a bankrupt hardware store. It was closing down. It was breaking up into 15 different countries. I was saying with my mouth open. Nobody foresaw that. I grew up in a world where we thought eventually we'd have a nuclear war, and then maybe we thought we'd have, this period of this we had this sort of hostile armed stability, and we thought maybe, eventually it would evolve into something resembling a normal country. But that would take long past my lifetime. When Gorbachev came to power, I called the 5 top Soviet experts in this country and asked them, is anything going to change? They all said no. 6 years later, this country doesn't exist anymore. And that was as much of a hardship for us as for them. Existentially, we had to say, wait a minute. We had defined ourselves since 1945 in not being them, not being the other. And all of a sudden, they're gone. So we had to ask ourselves, who are we? Days after the Soviet Union went out of business, I was talking to a colleague of mine named Dick Wright, who was a wonderful auto writer who spoke Russian, had intelligence, military intelligence in the service. He was not especially left-wing at all. He admired Walter Reuther. I suppose he was sort of like a Walter Reuther kind of Democrat. But he said to me, this is the worst thing that ever happened to this country. I said, why? He said, as long as the Soviet Union was there, the specter of communism, no matter how corrupt and far away from what it promised it was, there would be some restraint on the way American employers treated their workers. There would be a tolerance for our unions, because there's always the threat that people might turn to communism or socialism. And now that's all gone. And he says they're going to break unions. Wage levels are going to fall. I thought that he was being alarmist. I thought he was really exaggerating. He wasn't. And I think beyond that, the fall of the Soviet Union caused an existential crisis in this nation we haven't even begun to deal with. We still haven't. We don't know what to do. We started, without the Soviet Union, we started having wars with countries like Grenada. We started having wars with countries like, they had 2 ox carts. And sometimes the countries with 2 ox carts won, which was even worse. How can you get people psyched up for fighting Panama? But meanwhile, right as the Soviet Union was collapsing, the other development that would vastly change the world and us was going on in a laboratory in Switzerland, where there's an underemployed British researcher was messing around, and he was badly organized. So he was trying to create something on his computer that would help him organize his notes and find that stuff. So he started off, he called it the mesh, M-E-S-H. And then that sounded too much like mess. So he thought, he called it the information mine. And his name was Tim. But he thought that'd be too egotistical. So he thought, he finally thought, all right, I'm going to call it the World Wide Web. His name was Tim Berners-Lee, and you've never heard of him. And the reason you never heard of him is the person in the world who most deserves to be famous, who isn't famous. He invented the internet the way that, for all practical considerations, he invented what you think of as the internet. The internet existed before. It was government and university computers sending code to other government and university computers. He made it work, and he deliberately did not patent it. He wanted everyone to use it, so he gave it away for free. He probably could have been richer than Bill Gates. He didn't care. By the way, he had no money. He was driving a 13-year-old Volkswagen Rabbit at the time. But he has a good job at MIT. But that changed everything, and it changed it very fast. Cast your mind for a moment back to the long ago pre-internet world of, say, 1990. He invented the World Wide Web and the first browser in 1990. But really wasn't on the scene. In the world of 1990, besides having this sort of geopolitical consensus, we were hopeful then Gorbachev was reforming the Soviet Union. Nobody thought it would fall apart. But we sort of know who we were, and we had, and this is very important, it's a concept that I think I came up with, common intellectual furniture. Everybody got their news from a local news broadcast around about 6 o'clock at night. And from a national news broadcast, it was out at 6:30, mostly, sometimes 7, at one of the 3 major networks, CB and CNN. CNN was going then, but most people still watch network TV. And while the stories sometimes varied, they basically had the same content. They were all, what was the news was determined by people like me, guys in late middle age, gray hair, and suits, white guys. And while they certainly slighted women, and they slighted minorities, and they ignored gay people, and they ignored much of the developing world, they gave you a consensus. People knew what people were thinking about. That is all gone now. That has dissolved, because with the internet, with the proliferation of stations, with the decline of traditional legacy media, I have no idea what my students know about anything. I don't know where they get their news from. I don't know what they are thinking. There is no, and they had lacked the critical thinking skills to challenge where something comes from. To your average person, the New York Times website and Dropout Joe's Basement blog are 2 things on there, and they can find them. They may not be able to differentiate. You look for things in the days of old analog newspapers. They use the term analog for anything that's old. You would get your paper, and you would see random stories that you didn't expect to see. And you said, wow, that's interesting. Now I read newspapers online every morning. I get up at 4 o'clock, I drink a little Drano, and then I sit down and try to figure out what I'm going to do. It cleans me out, it cleans my pipes marvelously. And I figure out what I'm going to write about that day. So I call up the newspapers, and I say, okay, I'm going to read all stories about government and politics. Bing, 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 go down the list. So I don't see the random story about the giant octopus without a head that was washed up on the beach in Borneo that I used to read in the newspapers. And I look at what I'm looking for. Everybody does that. Everybody does that. So I know people who are world's biggest experts in porcelain, or they know all about soccer, and they have no idea who the governor of their state is. They have no idea what's happening to them. I was talking with some folks here before the presentation about people don't know what government they live in, they don't know what government they're under, they know about things happening, they don't know why, they don't know how to find out. So in the state of Michigan, what is the mainstay of Southeast Michigan's economy for the last century? The automotive industry. In my time, I'm 66. You could get out of high school. You might not even have to get out of high school. And you can get a job on the assembly line. And you could make, in today's money, about $100,000 a year with overtime. 100, 110. And you can have a house, you can have 2 cars, you can have a cabin up north, and life was good. You could send your kid to Michigan State. That was before, never mind. But when it was safe to send your kid to Michigan State. And all of a sudden, that vanished. Wham! It was all gone. You want to know what happened in the automotive industry? I'll give you one little factoid that'll illustrate it better than anything else I can say. In 1979, which was actually a recession year, General Motors had more blue-collar workers working on assembly lines in the city of Flint, not Detroit, within the city of Flint, than General Motors has today in the entire country. So that is advantage. Yes, the auto companies make a lot of money now, but they're no longer, and they never again will be, a mass employer of unskilled labor at high wages. And so we've got all sorts of people running around. One of my janitors at Wayne State is a guy who was making, he is now making 35% of what he made. And his job disappeared, and he thinks he's lucky to have this one, but he lost his house, he lost one of his cars, his daughter had to drop out of college, and he says, what happened to me? Well, I could give him a nice little lecture on the effects of automation and globalization. And somebody else might tell him the Mexicans took it. What might be easier for people to get their minds around? And so now we have a politics in this country of divisiveness, of people playing people against people, us against them, which I think is horribly destructive. And the question is, how do we get that back? Well, journalists are like Cassandra from the ancient, from the myth, where we sit up there, we tell you bad, unpleasant stuff, and we get unpopular with you, but we're much less good at telling you how we can fix it. Part of me, frankly, worries that the only way we can get a national consensus back would be have some overwhelming calamity hit this country, like the Great Depression, or a plague, or a war, somebody making war on us. Not a phony war, a real war. But I don't know. And some of me wonders if even that would work. And the bottom line, my friends, is I just don't know. But I care about this country. And I care about, one little political note. Somebody asked me, who should I vote for in the election, in these elections? How do I know who to vote for? And I said, simple. Vote for only those candidates who think your children's lives are more important than yours. We have had, by and large, because I see some other white and gray hair here other than mine, we have had an opportunity for a very good life in this country. One of the things that angers me most about my own generation is that we may be the first generation, we and Generation X after us, do not want their kids to have a better life than they did. Our parents wanted us to have a better life than they did, and by and large, we did. We need to see to it that that happens. Well, I can go on at great length. I'm a synthesis of the two most obnoxious professions in history, journalism and teaching. I can talk for hours about stuff I know nothing about. You may conclude you just heard half an hour on something I know nothing about. I'd much rather talk with you, answer any questions, or elucidate on things, or even you can argue with me if you don't throw sharp objects. So please, anybody have any questions? Where's the microphone? How are we doing this?
I have the microphone, and if you raise your hand, I can come to you. I also can pick up question cards if you prefer. I've actually gotten a few questions already, and I'm going to start with one, and that's
Sure.
individuals working to bring back civility in our everyday interactions. What can we do when folks are combative, divisive? Can we start at the local level, or do we need to look at what's happening in our political world? I mean, where do we go from here?
Excellent, great question. All politics is local. All of life is local. So yes, you want to, even if the highest leadership in the country is acting the way the bad kid in my 5th grade class acted on the playground and was made to sit in the principal's office. We don't need to do it. I hate to hesitate to afraid. It didn't work out very well for her, but wasn't it Hillary Clinton or was it Michelle Obama said, when they go low, we go high. We don't have it, they go low. But I mean, calling names, you start calling people names, they don't listen to you. You wanted people to sort of listen to you, to make your case. You want to talk to people rather than calling them names. I really think that people, I'm hoping, people are kind of getting dreary of this sort of armed camp, frozen dichotomy, them versus us, red versus blue, Trump voters versus Clinton voters. That's just not very useful. And most people aren't like that. Most people are not cartoon characters. They They play cartoon characters on TV. They stick a microphone in front of your face. You're supposed to say Trump-like things or Bernie-like things. But you try to find some way of appealing. The people who are doing that the best in the state are the people that started the Center for Michigan. Phil Power was a newspaper publisher who sold his newspapers and used some of the money to start the center to try to figure out the problems and make us one people again. They're doing that. They're having focus groups all over the state now to try to get people to sort of talk to each other. By the way, I think the best publication journalistically in the state is their online magazine, Bridge. It's bridge.mi. It's absolutely free. You can just read it. I'm on the member of the steering committee of it. When Phil sold his newspapers and started the Center for Michigan, it was bad personally for me because I was his last vice president of editorial operations. My job went away, but I always have 5 or 6 jobs anyway, so I survived, and they're doing great stuff. But no, you find some common ground with people. Because if you don't, so what? You just yell at people, swear at people, and if you've got, all right, let's say Trump was elected by a very narrow margin, everybody knows that. So if we have a slight change and you get a Democrat in, and there's still nearly half the people won't talk to that side either, we're really not accomplishing anything. So we have to figure out a way to do it.
This is great. As a couple of follow-ups, I've had 2 questions, I guess generally looking at the media landscape. Last week you had ex-CIA Director John Brennan calling the administration Kakistocracy. Yes.
It means governed by the words. Actually, the word comes from the Greek word for poop.
Yeah, the context clue was a little there. So what do we do when it seems our media landscape is, throwing insults back and forth between those who are in power, those who are in opposition?
Well, you're sweetly revenged on me because I'm part of the media. You want me to tell how to fix it. I can tell you sort of how things went wrong. We used to have something called the Fairness Doctrine, which meant that broadcast outlets, over-the-air broadcast outlets, had to give equal time to both sides. It was repealed in 1987. And we used to have something which still exists called the Federal Communications Commission that enforced broadcast news standards. What you may not realize is that somebody owns the Grand Rapids Press, or what's left of it. Somebody owns the New York Times, but nobody owns the airwaves. The airwaves are public spaces like the national parks. They license companies to write the broadcast on them, but the conditions of their lease, the FCC can demand that they not say certain things on the air. They can demand that they provide programming in the public interest, i.e. news, which they used to do. They don't tend to do that anymore. But we can sort of demand our government sort of regulate and police this stuff. But, and they're also, it's a for-profit thing, so they go for what on the internet is called clickbait. They go for sensational stuff for the same, they believe, with some accuracy, they're all 5-year-olds. You take a 5-year-old to the restaurant and say, would you like to have some meat and potatoes? Would you like to have a bowl of ice cream with chocolate sauce? You know how the 5-year-old is going to choose. And so they give us that. Now, we're all hypocrites ourselves. We take these surveys and we say, do you want responsible, serious news programs like the McNeil-Lehrer report that used to be on PBS? Or do you want overhyped, sensational stuff? Everybody says, oh no, we want that responsible, wonderful news. And what happens when the rating comes? The responsible, wonderful news gets 1 to 2% of the viewers, and the networks that says, now a new close-up of Kim Kardashian's spawn gets 85%. So this is a problem, but I think it's like water on rock. We just have to do it one person at a time.
We're collecting comment cards. I've gotten a few, but keep handing them in and raise your hand if you've got a question.
I'd rather talk to a live person. I won't bite.
I know, you're probably sick of hearing my voice.
No, I love your voice. I just want to interact with people. Yes. This gentleman here and then that lady. Yes.
Hi, Jack. I listened to you.
Don't say that on an airplane.
Do you that there is any credence to persons' progressive or conservative nature being genetic, and does that impact how we might relate to them in civility?
Genetic. That's interesting. I think people are more influenced by their environment, their education. People tend to be more like the people they're around with, associate with. And I also think that people, again, I really resist the urge to type people as, we put people in little boxes and slots, and we assign a role. They figure they should play out these roles. Most people probably would class me as some kind of progressive, whatever that means. But I'm not so sure that I'm going to vote for legalizing marijuana, partly because, not because I want to tell anyone what to do, it's because I drive 30,000 miles a year, and another class of inebriated persons on the road doesn't really appeal to me. And you also have people who are politically liberal, but culturally conservative, and back and forth. So I think it's who you associate with, what kind of groups. Pollsters can tell how you're going to vote without ever asking you how you're going to vote. They ask you a series of questions about your education, what kind of profession you have, how much money you make, and they can sort of assess most people from that. But what I think we ought to try hard to do, if you are conservative, try to look at things the way a Bernie Sanders person looks at it. If you are a liberal, try to figure out how conservatives see these things. And sometimes people make decisions for reasons that are not immediately apparent or not the postcard. I want to tell you one fast story. Back to the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, in the old days, you couldn't get any information. And they tried to judge how important people were from the size of their funeral when they died. There's some guy that had no particular job whatsoever in leadership. Yeah, and he was like, minor candidate. He died. They have a humongous funeral. The funeral was second only to the kind of funeral they would give the actual leader of the Soviet Union. Brezhnev or Khrushchev or somebody. And for years, people tried to figure that out. And I knew a man who did his PhD thesis on it. And I went to the Soviet Union with him right when things started to soften up. And he went, and I went with him, and he asked. And they said, "Oh, yes," the guy said. "We understand you in the West have been puzzled by this question. You've been trying to figure out why Evgeny Efromovich got such a big funeral. And now it is permitted to tell you. My friend, the academic, is salivating. He's quivering. He's going to find out." He said, "Yes, why was it?" And the guy, the Soviet guy, said, "We liked him." I said, "What?" "We liked him. He was a nice guy. He never sent anyone to Gulag. He remembered people's birthday. We gave him a giant funeral because we liked him." So, in the immortal words of Sigmund Freud, sometimes a cigar is only a cigar. And I think this lady had a question right here in the light blue. Was that right? You don't have a question? Like many women in my life, she didn't want to know anything about it. The best way to tell you.
I wondered if you could address the Facebook issue and what Mark Zuckerberg should do to fix it, if it needs fixing.
The lady would like to, what I should do to address the Facebook issue and what Mark Zuckerberg should do to fix it, if it needs fixing. I don't know. I don't know. I think we should be a little careful about what we put online. And I'm amazed, I'm fascinated by who's on Facebook, how many? More than half. The stuff that people put on there, I found out my husband was cheating on me. I did my laundry today. Here's a picture of my cat. And when Facebook, I thought it was all silly, but then people complained that I wouldn't be their Facebook friend. And my wife was upset because her daughter was complaining. So I said, all right, I'm going to do an experiment so you can write about this. I'm going to have a Facebook page. But all the information I put on it and the picture will be that of Joseph Stalin. And almost nobody noticed. Almost nobody noticed. And somebody said, "You really look good with a mustache." And so I stopped that when I got an email from some woman. I never commented on anything. I got an email from some woman who said, "You may not remember me, but you spoke in Muskegon 10 years ago, and we talked, and I thought we had a little special something. And my husband died, and I see that you're a widower. So Stalin's wife killed herself in the street. And I think maybe we should get I was horribly embarrassed. So I wrote back and I said, I'm terribly flattered, but if you read a little more carefully, you would notice I was born in 1879. I'm too old for you. But I realized, but Stalin was also horribly anti-Semitic. My stepson's a rabbi, so I changed it to Trotsky. And if you write, they will never learn anything about me from Facebook. They might from Amazon. Amazon knows everything about me. But if somebody writes, I liked what you said on the radio today, I say thank you. But no, I would not put it. Just be careful what you put on there. Yes, they should not be allowed to sell that information to other people, and they should prevent it from being hijacked. But I don't know how to do that. I have explained. I've been studying the internet, the technical workings of the internet for some years now. I can tell you that there's a very easy explanation. Because all the work is done. Next question.
What do you think of having a multi-political party system in our nation?
People ask me that. That's a very, very reasonable question. What about a multi-political party system in our government? It won't work. It's set up so it can't work. We have a dichotomy. It's set up because of the way power flows in Congress. You can only have two parties. One party could die, it would be replaced by another one. Now, it is conceivable that a third party candidate could get elected president. Ross Perot could have, except he was howling nuts. And he was leading in the polls for a while before he dropped out and he got back in, and he said that, and then when he said that George Bush sent lesbians to infiltrate his daughter's wedding, people started thinking, But he still got 20% of the vote. But if somebody got elected on a third party ticket, the first thing they'd have to do is immediately affiliate with either the Republicans or the Democrats. Why? Because everybody in Congress is a Republican or a Democrat. And if you don't join cause with one of them, about the only thing you're going to be able to do is pick out your wastebasket. So it's set up against that. And the parties have evolved over time. And Maine and Vermont used to be the most Republican states in the nation. They're now two of the most Democratic states. Vermont is the most Democratic state in the nation. They sometimes call it the People's Republic of Vermont. Whereas the Solid South, which used to be Democratic, is now a Republican. So you have changes. But I don't see any way you have a third party system in this country.
Hi, Jack. My question is about another enemy, a seeming enemy that we have, immigrants. A lot of people, this is my opinion, I guess, a lot of people in the U.S. feel economically disadvantaged, and many are. And so when immigrants come in, it feels to them that the few pennies that there are to share are theirs, and they don't want to share with immigrants. And so I think one of the problems we have is our economic system has damaged the middle class, and so many people are feeling economically disadvantaged that's why they're increasing in their difficulties with immigrants coming in the U.S. What do you think about that?
Well, madam, if you believe that, you've been sold a bill of goods that is all lies. The best thing this country can do is encourage more immigration. First of all, the best commentary on immigration I ever saw was a picture of Geronimo standing on a hill with a rifle, and it said, "Failing to enforce Homeland Security since 1492. As I recall, we are all descendants of immigrants, and of the immigrants today in this country, there are two kinds of immigrants. There are the kinds of immigrants who do the jobs nobody else wants to do for substandard wages. If Trump or anybody if he lived up to his promise to send all the illegal, so-called illegal undocumented people back, it would destroy the economy, especially the restaurant economy, especially the economy in places like Arizona and California. But in the main, immigrants are job creators. They come here, they work harder than we do. If you look at Wayne State, I go to commencement every year, Wayne State, and you look at the list of graduates. In the sciences and engineering, it looks like an amalgam of the phone books from Taiwan and Pakistan, with one Anglo name. They come over here, they start businesses, they hire people. They're very good for our economy. I would dump Snyder. I don't always think Governor Snyder has any idea what he's doing, but he got this. He asked the government, he didn't get this, for permission to get a vast number of immigrants, visas for highly skilled immigrants, and it was a proviso they live in Detroit and rebuild that place. So they do not take middle-class jobs, they create jobs. Yes, they are bringing over, employers want to bring over high-skilled immigrants because they simply can't find them here to do those kinds of jobs that they need them to do. They're very hard-working people. There's an organization I help in Detroit called Freedom House, which takes people seeking asylum. They're tortured in their other countries. There's still a constitutional right, by the way, if you prove that you left your country because you had a reasonable fear of being killed, persecuted, you have the right to be an American citizen if you can prove that in court. And those folks have been very, very much a good part of this society. Yes, some immigrants are bad people. Every so often there's somebody who's a bad person. Yes, we don't want to let anybody in who promotes terrorism. There's a big crackdown on that after 9/11. Remember there were the 19 terrorists who were killed on those airplanes. Most of them were students. You know what happened 6 months after 9/11? The government renewed all their student visas and sent them mail with visas. So, obviously, the government doesn't talk to each other, different parts of the government. But no, if we have been sold a bill of goods about immigrants, of course you need to have some screening. Of course you need to keep out questionable people or people who have contagious diseases, etc. This is a country that was built by immigrants on immigration, and we need more of it. By the way, my family, I come from a distinguished line of poor white trash on both sides, but at least my father's side, they've been in this country accomplishing nothing since about 1700, and I have tried my best to continue that tradition.
We've got a couple of texted questions, and we've got one more question over there. So we'll do some speed questions. First of all,
Is that like speed dating?
a little bit, should be as fun. 24-hour news cycle, how has that changed? And then also, if you could comment on gerrymandering.
I'm glad that somebody asked about a 24-hour news cycle. If we had had the internet and tweeting during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we would have had a nuclear war because there's constant pressure to produce more headlines. More headlines, have a headline every second. During the worst part of the Cuban Missile Crisis, at one point, our government got 2 communications at the same time from the Kremlin, one of which was extremely belligerent, and the other of which was conciliatory. Robert Kennedy talked about that just for 13 days. And they looked at him, and President Kennedy said, "What do we do?" Robert Kennedy said, "Ignore the nasty one, answer the nice one." And so we didn't end up losing Florida. So, but yeah, the 24-hour news cycle, sometimes Thomas Friedman, the great correspondent for the New York Times, when he won 2 Pulitzer Prizes very young, I met him, I was at a dinner with him in 1992. And I said, "I read you every day." He said, "No." He said, "They make me write a story every day, but nothing's new every day. So I put out 2 new sentences and write the same story." Well, there isn't always 24 hours worth to do. Some things bear some contemplation. And tweeting, I think, is the work of the devil. I mean, it's stupid. It's moronic. The idea of news professionals is we have editors. We think about this stuff. We filter this stuff. One of my very best friends is a brilliant woman journalist in Wyoming. And she says, "You should be tweeting all the time. You do these brilliant commentaries." I said, "No, I'm not going to try to distill my great thoughts, half-baked thoughts, into 140 characters. If somebody reads a tweet, they're not going to read the rest of what I did. So I'm not going to do that." I think tweeting has its place. for hard news stories, like, okay, you know, you tweet Second Coming, you tweet about that. California falls in the ocean, okay. Well, you look at most, you know, plus, as I get closer and closer to assisted living, I realize that I have only an infinite amount of time. I have not an infinite amount of time. There's only so much time I want to spend reading somebody's tweet that Trump still didn't come out, or looking on Facebook and saying, I scratched my backside today. No, so I'm against that. Gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is one of the two things that has destroyed government in Michigan. The other is term limits. You may have a chance. There's a group called Voters Not Politicians. They collected, without paying for them, more than enough signatures to put an anti-gerrymandering constitutional amendment on the ballot this November. If it gets on, vote for it. It will. They got one on the ballot in Ohio a few years ago. It was composed by the Ohio Republican Party, most of it, and the Conservatives, and it passed with 71% of the vote. This will pass because it's on the ballot. They're doing all sorts of court challenges to keep them off. And when you can, you need to get rid of term limits. All term limits does is ensure that the politicians in power now will not address any of the real problems. They'll sweep them under the rug. That you'll have government by lobbyists and special interests because they're not there long enough to lose their jobs. And it fosters corruption. Because in our present system, we're the worst term limits in the country. A lot of states, like Ohio, have a system of term limits. They have to sit out a term every so often. That's okay. We have what they say now is, okay, you can serve 6 years and you can never come back. So the average state legislator, they make $73,000 a year, which isn't terrible, it isn't much. So you're in your last 2 years, you're 45, you got some kids in high school, maybe in college, and you can do it one of two things. You can vote the interests of the people, or you can vote the way these special interests are telling you and hope they'll give you a job as a lobbyist afterwards. What are you going to do? Well, I can tell you very well what they do. So, you know, we used to have one of the best and most responsive governments, and now we have the worst in the state, in the country. We're the worst state government in the state, in this entire country. You want proof? I'll give it to you in one word: roads.
Yes. Okay, we'll do two questions, one and then in the middle.
There's a book by Jeffrey Sachs called The Price of Civilization.
Yep.
And he writes that if people were informed and they had more understanding of what other people value, there'd be more consensus and more sort of conversation. So I'm wondering about how do we encourage increasing conversation? And I'm thinking in my mind about Betsy DuBois and what her goals are or appear to be in terms of ending public education. And maybe that's just a side comment, but what are your thoughts on increasing awareness in the electorate?
I think we should do it. I think that we are partly I think Betsy DuBois is, I think, a very nice woman and a very nice human being who has ghastly wrong-headed ideas. And we are becoming very rapidly a society. The biggest uncovered story in America is that since 1973 we've had at first a slow and then a rapid transfer of wealth from the poor half of the population to the upper 1% of the population. And so we're becoming a society now. We have a very few people who have lots of resources and lots of information, and a whole lot of people who have dwindling resources and have no idea what the hell is happening to them. Now, previous societies along that model were France before 1789, Tsarist Russia before the Bolshevik Revolution, the latter Roman Empire. They did not have good outcomes. I rest my case.
Okay, last question.
Thank you. Would you speak to the Sinclair? I'm not sure if it's called a corporation, but that's purchased all the small television stations, and so they're now requiring that they all give.
That's the ghastly thing with the anchors all have to read this thing.
Yeah. Do you? Is there?
Is there a way that these stations will be able to regain their independence, or is this just a trend that you think is going to grow?
If you had somebody, a president with the guts, to appoint Federal Communications Commission governors, there's 5 board members, who would prevent that kind of thing. Again, the government has great power over what's set out on the broadcast airwaves because of something called spectrum scarcity. There's only so much, the government regulates them because there's only so much space. You only have so many stations. By the way, if you think this is a horrible socialist plot, private industry begged the government to do this in 1912 because they were drowning each other out, they couldn't discipline themselves. So, if you did that, you want to solve the remember the Supreme Court in the Citizens versus United said you can't have any restraints on campaign spending. Well, there's a way around that too. And the FCC could impose restraints on spending on broadcast television, which is what we're all talking about. It doesn't matter if you pull the buttons or bumper stickers you pop out, it's broadcast communications. And if they regulated those and they had told, okay, everybody gets so much time, and they regulated the content of it. Bridget McCormick is probably the brightest woman on the Michigan Supreme Court. She's a Democrat, but she's not especially partisan. When she ran for the Supreme Court, an anonymous group, by the way, in this state, I'll come back to this, an anonymous group ran a commercial saying she loved terrorists. Why did she put that? Because she was obligated as an attorney to volunteer to represent someone at Guantanamo if the government needed her to. So they twisted that. By the way, when the Supreme Court said that we have no right to prevent campaign spending in Citizens United, they also said that we have every right to compel full disclosure of who's spending what on whom. Not in the state of Michigan. The state of Michigan expressly outlawed that. So, I could form a group called Citizens for Puppies and Kittens. And I could take funding secretly from the Ku Klux Klan, from NAMBLA, which is a group that promotes child molestation, anybody else you name, and I could run broadcast television ads attacking somebody. And they would have no right to find out in this state who's behind that. That's nuts. That is nuts. And we need to find a way of dealing with that stuff. I'm sorry I'm depressing the hell out of all of you, but that's my function.
Well, this has been a great, engaging
I
conversation
knew I
nonetheless. No. You haven't worn out your welcome, but we do have to close down. The library's going to shut down soon.
Thank you all very, very much.